Theme Review. That's right, it is I, Quincelton Moracious, here with an emergency, unnecessary critique of every card in The Hunt, an upcoming game by Salt and Pepper Games that looks really interesting. I read through the whole rulebook, watched a bunch of gameplay videos of demonstrating gameplay and of the rules of the game, and I got really excited, and then I looked through the rulebook and saw the cards, and my theme senses were triggered because I like this game and am excited for it to come out, and thus when I see a card that does not properly adopt theme, it makes me an unhappy Morris. So I'm gonna go through every card in this game. A lot of them are very good, and overall the game looks very good, but some are not. Now, some of that may be because this game is translated from Spanish, and some of the translations aren't quite right. Part of the reason is because a lot of this is prototype, and they may be working on the verbiage, which is why I'm doing this emergency theme review, so that hopefully, instead of how these reviews usually go, where I'm reviewing some game that's been out for a long, long time, and I'm complaining to people who will never change the game, maybe some of these ideas will actually be incorporated. So, Salt and Pepper Games, I am doing this because I care about you, and I want your game to make lots of money, and I also care about theme. I am a big believer that cards in games should reflect specific, understandable events that make sense for the faction to play. That shouldn't seem like it's a hard thing to do in games, but most games are about 70-30 in terms of how well they are in adapting theme in their card text. I am not suggesting any mechanical changes or strategy changes or any changes to the game itself. I'm just suggesting word changes to the titles of cards and maybe once or twice to the art. So, let's get started with a card which is actually fine. Fair Weather. Normally I'm against cards representing weather in games when they are playable by a faction, because unless that faction are part of magical wizards or the allies from Red Alert 2, you can't control weather. But this card is representing weather stations and deep sea trawlers that act as floating stations, transmitting weather data to the various navies. And so for that reason, I'm okay with it, also because the effect of this card affects both sides to a degree. And that I really, really like. That's a good way of implementing weather, in that the weather will affect both sides. One of the factions knows about the weather and is thus able to benefit from it more. However, I would still change the name of the card, because what the card is representing specifically is not really the fair weather or the storm at sea, and basically I have the same thing to say about both of these cards, because they do the same thing in reverse. But the card is representing the meteorological data, and in this case, you have better meteorologists or better ability to communicate that information to your faction. So it should be called Weather Stations, Fair Weather, or Weather Report. That's actually probably what I would call this card. I would take a page from the Fortune and Glory school of designing cards. Great card designers, the guys over there at Flying Frog. And so I would make this what I call a colon card. So it would have the first word, Weather Report, Fair Weather. And then for the storm at sea, I would name it Weather Report, Storm. You can cut the at sea. Obviously, it's at sea because everything's going to be at sea because we're boats on the ocean. We don't care if it's on land. Just call it storm. But other than that, I honestly wouldn't change it. And if you kept it the way that it is, I wouldn't be that mad. Some of these I'm going to be pretty politely mad about. But this is fine. It's a solid B in terms of theme. Now this, the cat and mouse game. Okay, this is pretty bad. Not just because it should be called Game of Cat and Mouse, which is how it would be said in our parlance. Okay, it's translated from Spanish. I shouldn't be too hard on you guys. You know, you do want to get it right, and they have fixed some verbiage in previous prototypes, and good for you guys for doing that. The problem with this is that there are two problems with the name of this card, or well, with this card in general. The first is that the card is called the Cat and Mouse game, which is very, very vague. I don't understand what that means. I mean, I understand that a game of cat and mouse is when one faction is chasing another faction who's trying to hide. That's the whole game of the hunt. So what does this card represent specifically? It's like you have a fighting game, and then you have a card that you play called Fight the Other Person. And it's like, I thought that's what we were doing this whole time. Why is this different? And that's not related to the effect that's printed on the card. The effect that's printed on the card is that the other player sums up their total AP and tells you what it is. And then you get to take an average turn. So it's basically free information to the other player that they can use to deduce things. Now that's an interesting effect and a fun idea. And again, I'm not trying to critique any of the mechanics of the game, just the theme. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm just going to rename this card. What is a card, an effect, an event that represents free information that isn't necessarily specific, but is general information and that represents the era? And so it came to me, and I would say, oh, you name this card in reference to the phrase, loose lips sink ships, which was this saying during the time period of not talking about any military data, because if it got out, it can get to the other side and cause bad stuff to happen. And so I would just name this card Loose Lips. Your faction has spies that hears information from people saying stuff in areas and coffee shops and different things that give you vague information that you might be able to piece together to give you helpful stuff, which is what this is. It's sort of vague information that maybe you can piece together, and I feel that's really thematic. It's much more specific. Now you may have to change the art here because you'll want to show people talking in like a Uruguay coffee shop or something about something they saw off the coast. But I think that's good because a whole lot of your pictures here are going to be of like boats, and I'm okay with pictures of boats. I love boats as much as the next guy, but there's just so much art that's just pictures of boats. You could have it be the same thing. It would be better if you changed it. I understand that it's late in the production cycle if you can't do it. But really, I would just rename this card Loose Lips. Okay, Concentrated Fire. Now, I'm a fan of verbing cards, so I would call it Concentrate Fire. Like, I'm going to play this card to concentrate fire. I have done something to concentrate fire. That's not a big deal. Now, the problem I have with this card is the effect. And I'm going to juxtapose this with the Cumberland, which I'll talk about more when I get to it, but also with the Germans' version of that, which is radar technology. So you have two different combat cards that do different effects. One is to let you look at the other person's hand. Another one is to make it so your next couple turns you have an increase in your combat capabilities. And so I'm thinking, okay, look at the other person's hand or increase your combat capabilities. Do I think that radar is going... Which effect do you think radar is going to do? Which effect do you think Concentrate Fire is going to do? Do you think Concentrate Fire is going to let you look at the other person's hand? Now, I understand that looking at the other person's hand helps you a lot in combat. And so mechanically speaking, this is thematic. You are doing a thing that gives you an advantage to fight the other player better. But thematically, in terms of just like lore, it doesn't make as much like sense. It makes more sense that radar would let you look at somebody else's hand, because it's giving you this information about positioning, especially for the Germans, because they used radar rangefinders, and those were really effective. And one of the reasons why their gunnery was so accurate. And yeah, you can easily have radar also represent increasing the strength of your gunnery for that reason, but it just makes so much more sense for radar to represent looking at an opponent, looking at the other person's hand. Concentrate Fire. Now, if you did want to keep this art and just have it be the same way, and you didn't want to listen to me, you're like, no, David, I want no, Quincy, I want the radar to represent increasing power. Okay, then I wouldn't call this concentrate fire. There is actually a naval maneuver involved firing at 3 different ranges and then judging where they drop and which ones drop where, and judging the ranges of those and the position to the target in order to readjust your aim and fire better. And so the idea is that you're wasting a shot, which this makes sense with because it's a low value card, so you're kind of guaranteeing that you miss so that in the future you have better shots. I don't know the name of that maneuver, and if you can look that up, that would be better than calling it concentrated fire. Unless it really is called concentrated fire, which I'm pretty sure it's not. Honestly, I would just swap these effects, and I'll get to the Cumberland in a little bit when I get to it. Okay, that never happened. So this is a counter spell of sorts. It makes it where you force someone not to use an event and instead use the ops for a card. So this is sort of taking the Flying Frog school of naming counter spells. Flying Frog always names his counter spells things like "I don't think so," or "I think not," or "nuh-uh," that sort of thing. And that's sort of the same kind of energy that's going on here. That's very funny, but I don't really have an understanding in my mind of what is happening when I play the card "That Never Happened." How have I kept like a storm from happening, or like the Royal Navy from showing up, or something like just saying no, it didn't happen? Like, I don't understand thematically what's happening when I play that card. I know that what they were going to do didn't happen, but why? Now, when I look at the theme on this and I look at the art, I'm thinking, okay, this has to do with like intel and gathering data and getting bad data. And getting information that's wrong, and you're planning based on information that's wrong. You think you have this event, you do it, but that information is wrong. So call this card Bad Intel, or Wrong Intel, or Fog of War. Any of those is more specific and good and represents a thing that should be represented in the game, far more specifically than just what is essentially a card that says nuh-uh. Okay, moving on down to Rules of Prize Warfare. I'm a little conflicted on this. Generally, I like it. It's a card that lets you pull an event from your discard pile. What that has to do with the Rules of Prize Warfare is a little weird. Basically, what it's representing, I think, is the idea that the Germans were capturing British ships, but they were taking all the crew alive, putting them on lifeboats, and sending those lifeboats to the shore where they could be picked up by the British eventually later. So the idea is the British is losing cards, but because the Germans generally aren't killing the crews of their ships, they're able to gain those people back later, and then the intel and the capabilities and the lives of those people are able to re-help the British later, and so because of the Rules of Prize Warfare, they're able to pull a card from the discard pile back. How that affects the Germans is a little weird to me. I guess what they're trying to represent is that the Rules of Prize Warfare was kind of double-edged sword, and it was an advantage to the Germans in some way and a disadvantage to them in some way, and so that's why both players have a copy of the same card. But I don't know. This, you really don't need to change it, but I might change the name of the German card to the Phony War, representing the fact that at this time in the war, the British were not as mobilized or intent to fight as they were later, or as, well, they weren't as mobilized or intent to fight as, say, the Germans were at this time. And so the Germans' ability to be more aggressive allows them to pull an event from the discard pile. Honestly, not a big deal. You can keep it named the way that it is. It's not as bad as some of the other ones we'll get to. Storm at Sea I already talked about. Generally a good card. Honestly, I like how the weather cards are designed. Okay, the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy has the same problem that the Kriegsmarine has. And I'm going to be mispronouncing everything because as an American, that is my right. My ancestors fought and died so we could mispronounce European things. Here's the problem with having a card called the Royal Navy in this game. When you're playing as the British faction, you're playing as the Royal Navy. So before you played this card, were you not the Royal Navy? Are you only now the Royal Navy when you play it? When the card goes away, do you stop being the Royal Navy? Do you understand why this is like confusing? The card is trying to represent like the better training or experience that the Royal Navy had. If that's what it's trying to represent, then it should specify that. It should specify some specific capacity that the Royal Navy was good at, like Harwood's intuition. You know, it's referencing a specific skill or facet of Harwood that made him good. I have my own problems with this card, but the name is fine. So this should be the Royal Navy's intrepidness or tenacity or something. But honestly, I wouldn't name it that. Because what is this card representing? Well, this card is representing your ability to bank a resource, bank an AP, and hold it for later. Basically, you're doing an action now to prepare for a better action later. What is that mechanically that's happening? What it is, and what I think this card should be renamed to, is Drill. Drill Crews, or Double Drill Crews. Because obviously you're drilling your crews during all of this, but the idea of you spend time, instead of searching for the enemy ship, drilling your crews more, so that later when you do end up fighting him, you can operate more efficiently, and you have that extra AP. Yes, you would likely need to change the art, but I have ideas for that later that you can probably swap some art out and it won't be a problem. But that feels a lot more like a thing that I have done. If I've drawn the Royal Navy and I play it, I don't know what I have done. Like what has my faction done? We have done a thing that makes us more like the Royal Navy? I don't get that. If I have a card called Drill Crews, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm playing this and I'm going to drill my people. And they're going to be practicing. And hey, that means that later on they'll be better. That makes sense. That tells a story that I can understand. And you don't need to change anything, just the name. And I'm going to change Kriegsmarine too, for similar reasons. And it's not that I have anything against the Royal Navy, it's that you're playing as the Royal Navy. So, like, why do you have a card that also represents it? Now, you would think I would have the same problem with the card Sir Henry Harwood, because aren't you playing as Sir Henry Harwood? Not necessarily when it comes to the British. You sort of are, but there's like a lot of captains and various officers, and there's a whole lot that goes into the decision-making process in an operation like this, specifically for the British here. I actually do have a problem with the German captain, because when you're playing as the Germans, you do essentially play as the commander of the Gaff Spee. But you don't necessarily play as Sir Henry Harwood, so it's fine to have him represented, and he should be. He should be representative. If the assumption is not that the player is this character, therefore the character definitely should be in the game, because his tenacity and skill in the battle was really, really important. He was knighted because of it, heavily promoted. It was a big deal. Definitely include him in the game. And this is a fine way to do it. A lot of games do this, like Thomas Jefferson is represented in a similar way of, like, move all of your ships. You know, do everything you were doing normally, but just do it better. And that's fine. That's good. That's a pretty good way of incorporating the historical figure. Okay, new convoy routes. So this does a bunch of different things. And at first I was kind of like, I don't know, that's kind of vague. But I'm actually okay with it, because since the effect of this card does a bunch of different disparate things, they're all just sort of annoying to the Germans. The idea of, like, setting up new convoy routes forces the Germans to expand more resources, or forces the preparation that they made to ambush you here to not work, because you're now having a new combat route, and they're having to move in ways that make them more detectable because they're having to raid areas that they're not used to. It makes enough sense that honestly it's a pretty well designed card. When I play new convoy routes, I feel like I have done a thing. I have told all of the freighters, hey, use this different route because this other route is being patrolled by enemy commerce raiders. And now the Germans are like, oh, dang it, they're using different routes. We got to do the other stuff. You know, I feel like I've done a thing. It tells a story. I get it. Good card. Well done. Okay. Harwood's Intuition. Oh, boy. Okay. Now, when I first saw this card, I was like, oh, hey, good card. I like that. They even have different art for each of the 3 versions of this card. I love it. It's great. He was a big deal. And, hey, they're even using an aspect of him, not just naming it after the character. I love that. I love that in Shores of Tripoli, how they're like, you know, the daring Stephen Decatur. I love that they're like name after an aspect of the character. That's really, really great. I love that. And then I saw that he was also just a normal card. Okay, there is a rule in game design that when you have different cards, so like this and this and this, these aren't different cards. This is the same cards, just 3 copies of it. These are different cards. When you have different cards, they cannot represent the same thematic thing. That is very, very important. Because you've basically wasted design space. You could have each of these cards represent the different task force leaders, the commanders of Task Force K and H and the other letters that took part in the hunting down of the GAFSP. And that would be really cool. It's like, oh, this guy's intuition, or this guy's intrepidness, or this guy's training. You know, look it up, figure out who they were, and then you can name them all after that. That would be really good. Instead, you're basically saying the entire battle was won by Sir Henry Harwood. Obviously, what he did shouldn't be understated, but you're wasting time that could be done to praise everybody and give honor to everybody that took part in the battle. And no, it's just like Sir Henry Harwood again and Sir Henry Harwood again. You have design space to represent other characters. Do it. But the other reason I don't like this card, in terms of design, the effect actually looks really interesting, is because what this card actually represents is an event and an effect that is currently not represented in the game. The event where the freighters that were commerce rated were able to send out a distress signal before they were captured. Several of the freighters were captured before they could send out a commerce raider because the GAFSP surprised them. It snuck up on them. It's like, hello, fellow commerce boat. I also am commerce boat. And then it pulls out a gun and it says, don't radio anything. We'll blow you out of the water. That's my understanding of how a lot of these engagements went. And a whole lot of the time, they were not able to send out a distress signal, except for a couple that were. And that was a big shift in the battle, of them being able to send out a distress signal before they were captured, which was a huge boon to the British in being able to hunt down the GAFSP, which is why this card should be called Distress Signal Sent. That is far more specific, far more thematic, far more historic. And I wouldn't have suggested that if Sir Henry Harwood wasn't another card. I don't want to take him out of the game. Absolutely. He should be a card in the game. And I'm even fine with him having be 3 copies of the same card, but not if he's also this card. So pick one. Either he's this or he's this. He can't be both. This really should be Distress Signal Received. The card represents, oh, my freighter captains are really on the ball and they're really prepared to be able to send distress signals if they're about to be captured, and that's going to help my guys counterattack him. And that's what this card should represent. Distress Signal Received. Now, the annoying thing is, if you do that, you're probably going to need to change the art. And I know the art is so good. And maybe you don't have to. I mean, it's like, oh, he just received he just heard there was a distress signal in this area. We got to go hunt him down. You know, you don't have to necessarily change the art, but really that's what the card represents, and so that's what the card needs to be named. Okay, from bad to worse. Force K and H, which this is also called K and H Forces. Okay. Forces K and H are in the game already. They are tokens. Look, there they are. Force K and Force H. They are things on the board that are in the game. There they are. There is Force K. There is Force H. So what in the name of all sorts of creative Texan expletives does this card represent? Remember the rule? No mechanic or effect, no thematic event should be represented by multiple cards or multiple effects. Unless it's like a different version of those effects. You know, like bad weather and good weather, that's fine to have be different things because they're effectively different effects. But you have a card representing the troops, and then you have tokens representing the troops. The only way where a card like this name would be acceptable if this is the card that brought those forces immediately into play, but they aren't necessarily, because they also do other stuff. Yes, they can move those forces along the track, but even then, that doesn't really work, because what does the card represent? Those forces exist, this card just makes them like exist more or move faster, or like, oh, we are extra special forces K and H today, let's move even faster. Like, I don't understand what the story is that is telling, which is a real shame because the design of this card is really good, and the game has a space for a card like this. There should be a card in the game that represents the logistical superiority of the British during this conflict in terms of its naval prowess, which is really what mechanically this card is representing. You're able to deploy your ships faster, able to move faster, do your searches faster, get your ships onto the field faster because you're Britain and you have the British Navy, which is the preeminent navy in the world. And yes, the German Navy was very strong, but it really was an underdog compared to the British, and so having a card represent that is good. But when the British think of what makes their navy so good, they don't think, oh yes, when I think of the Great British Navy, the specific thing that always comes to my mind as like the specific thing that makes us all good throughout history and during the war was specifically forces K and H. I'm not trying to downplay them, but what I'm saying is that the card is way too thematically specific. Most of the time I'm saying you need to be more specific with these cards, but not with this, which is why I think this card should be named something like Rule Britannia. Some sort of reference to the idea of Britannia's, or of Britain's, the UK's, I'm going to misspeak it a bunch of times because, again, I'm American and I have that right, their predominance on the sea. Because right now it's just duplicating an effect that's already in the game. I don't know what story this card says. If I draw Rule Britannia, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. I am playing the British, and man, we are really good at boats and such. So when I play this down, I'm like, I remind you, German player, that you are facing the entire power of the British Navy, and we're just so good at being the British Navy. Look at it, and then you do a bunch of British Navy stuff. That, I mean, it's still general, but it at least is in the realm of understanding what is happening in terms of a story. Okay, moving on. Scuttling in Montevideo. So, fun fact, this card and its name is actually what inspired me to make this video. Because when I looked at this card, I was like, okay, this is a British card played by the British. The British did not scuttle the Gaff Spee. So why do the British have a card that they play that scuttles the Gaff Spee? That makes no sense to me. Now, to a degree, sometimes you have to have cards like that. The things that the other side can't predict of an event that happened, like weather or unreliable technology, actually, I'm fine with. That the other faction didn't necessarily have control over, but you don't want the faction that it hurts knowing when it's going to come out. But there is something you can have to represent a proactive step the British did that resulted in, or encouraged, or made the Germans more likely to scuttle the Gaff Spee. And that was the faked reinforcements, which is what I think this card should be called. Fake reinforcements, or Phantom Fleet, or something like that. The British being able to fool the Germans into thinking that they had these capital ships moving in to blockade Montevideo. And the Gaff Spee is like, oh man, maybe I could have survived against 2 heavily damaged light cruisers. He didn't know about the Cumberland coming in. But man, if there's 2 big capital ships coming in and an aircraft carrier, there's no way I can beat that. I don't want this ship falling into their hands. I'm going to scuttle it. And so that's what it should represent, is the plan to fool the Germans. A lot of this conflict was all of the political and subterfuge stuff that happened once the Gaff Spee escaped to Uruguay. So this card should represent that. The trickery, the subterfuge, which is another thing that the British were really, really good at. And so having a card representing that of like, haha, our spies are in place to be able to plant the false evidence, to fool the Germans. So we know that. So now we can proceed with the attack knowing that we can try to pull off this plan, our spy networks. But it doesn't say that. It doesn't have any of that theme in the title. It just shows it being scuttled as if the British were the ones that scuttled it. Okay. Mile by Mile. Good card. At first I was like, what is this referencing? But apparently it's referencing a quote by Harwood saying that he would search the South Atlantic mile by not mile if necessary, referencing the very precise and methodical nature and the hard work of just like they worked hard to search for the GAFSP and they work extra hard with this card. And that's what it does. You search a lot. Great card. Well-designed card. Good. Art matches up. Wonderful. Moving on. Unreliable technology. Yeah, I'm okay with it. Generally, I was kind of thinking like this card should, and the whole mechanic with the plane should be that you're running out of fuel and then you have to refuel it and then you spend the fuel and have to refuel it. But given how much maintenance needs to be done on these kind of float planes, I kind of get that. Again, it's weird that the British can proactively make the Germans' plane break, but there isn't a better version of this because unlike with the scuttling of the Graf Spee, there wasn't actually a thing the British did to like proactively break the Germans' plane. So just having it be a British card to represent the unreliability of the Germans' float planes at this time, because yeah, launching a float plane from a battleship is, it's very tricky and hard to do, and it did eventually break, and so I'm fine with it. If the AR-196 was a prototype at this time, I'll take your word for it. But as far as I know, it wasn't. But I will defer to the historical knowledge of the makers of this game. Okay, HMS Cumberland. Okay. Here's what I have to say about the HMS Cumberland. In theory, I like this card. I actually really like the idea of having events be possible in the game that did not happen in history, but could have happened, and various leaders of the conflicts made decisions with the assumption that that event that didn't happen was possible. And so basically what this card represents is the reinforcements actually showing up on time. Now the HMS Cumberland showed up after the fight. As far as I know, somewhat surprising to the British. And so and a lot of times the commander of the Graf Spee would make decisions thinking that reinforcements were nearby. Part of the reason he engaged the British is he thought, oh, there are these light cruisers chasing me. They're trying to push me into a trap of some larger force, but they're dispersed now. I can engage now and attack them before they push me into the reinforcements. But the reinforcements weren't there, and if he had just tried to get away, maybe he would have. We don't know. But the HMS, and so having a card represent like reinforcements actually showing up, I'm not necessarily against, but here's the problem. The HMS Cumberland didn't show up, and as far as I understand, the HMS Cumberland was kind of an older, not very good heavy cruiser. I mean, it was a heavy cruiser, and you can't say no to a boat, but like, why should the card that represents fighting better be for the HMS Cumberland? Shouldn't it be the, I think it was called the Executor? Or was it the Exeter? I don't know. I don't know how to speak in correct accents. But honestly, I still think that's a little too vague. It's weird that it's like this card only lasts for 2 battles, and so it's like the Cumberland shows up for 2 battles and then just leaves for some reason, I guess. Whereas, like, if it's an entire new ship coming up, shouldn't that be a big deal? And it's a big shift from what history was. And the biggest reason, so this is basically the British's version of the radar card, is that there's a lot of other things that you should name this card. I'm a big believer that battle events should be very, very specific. Because like the hunt events are more vague and general, and like there's the idea of this strategy not working, or like this plan being put in place, or this technology being dispersed over a wide area, and so the effects are kind of general and vague, and you can be kind of vague with some of the events. But when it comes to battle events, it's like we move to this location, we fire with this weapon, we hold off on using this piece of equipment. It should be very specific. It's like, why are you holding off on using a boat? So there's a few things that you could retheme this as. I think, and this way you could probably actually keep the art, you could name it to disperse forces. One of the big advantages Harwood was able to leverage against the Graf Spee is that he split up his forces when the Graf Spee attacked to do a pincer attack, because he knew he had all of these smaller boats, and so if he could divide the enemy's fire, it would limit its ability of its big effective broadsides, because it was basically having to point at one boat at a time. And so a card for dispersing disperse fleet That's fine. It's like, oh, hey, yeah, a single boat by itself. Look at that boat. It's dispersed away from the fleet. That's more specific, it's more historic, it makes more sense, and it represents a very smart, cool thing that Harwood did that was effective. And it makes sense that it only lasts for a couple turns. You know, you set up this good formation, and then after a while, you know, formations break down and there's a flow of battle and things are in different areas, and, you know, a formation will help for a while, and then eventually its advantage will let way off. Another thing that you could name this card that could be good is naming it Launch Torpedoes. One of the things the Exeter did is that it fired torpedoes at the Gaffspee. The Gaffspee avoided them, and in the process of having to avoid them, it messed up its firing arcs and opened itself up to being attacked by the light cruisers, is my understanding of a sequence of events that happened. So, having a card that represents torpedoes, and then it's like, oh, for this attack, we do a different kind of attack, a torpedo attack, and you have to avoid them, and so for the next 2 turns, we have a better attack on you. All of those are more specific and thematic and more historic effects that just make more sense than a boat that never showed up for the fight, that should stick around the whole time. And yeah, I really don't think this card should be named the HMS Cumberland. Okay, Kriegsmarine. All right, let me ask you a question. So the Kriegsmarine, the surface fleet of the Germans. Why does the German surface fleet existing mean that you can move a British freighter one space in any direction? So that makes like 0 sense to me. I guess boats are scaring the freighter in a certain direction, but if that's the case, I think you should name it actually after the sister ship, the Graf Scheer, which was the sister ship of the Gaffspee. And then you're more specific of like, oh, the sister ship is doing a thing. And I have thoughts on this sister ship card I'll get to. But really, this should just be named something like Impersonate Escort or Distress Signal or something that represents fooling a freighter into moving into a space that they shouldn't. Something that's at least tangentially related to that effect. Right now, it just sort of is like you needed an effect, you named something after the British Navy, and then we're like, well, we should also name something after the Kriegsmarine. I don't think the thing should be named after the Royal Navy. I don't think it should be named after the Kriegsmarine. Change it to either the name of the Gaff Scheer or Impersonate Escort. All of that makes more thematic sense. Okay. Okay, next one. Punta del Este. So when I first saw this card, I was like, oh, I wonder what that's a reference to. Well, when I first saw it, I was like, oh, this must be the Spanish card. And I was like, nope, no, this is the English card. I wonder what it's a reference to. I don't know. I looked it up. It's the name of the city in Uruguay that the Gaffspee escaped to. So this is actually really bad. Most of the others are just sort of like, you know, maybe fix it or it doesn't make sense. So this card is implying that Uruguay helped the Nazis in this battle, which they very much did not. They very much tried to play neutral here and didn't really take sides as far as I know. I mean, most of the historical analysis I've seen has been that Uruguay tried to be pretty neutral in this conflict. So having a card represent an implication that Uruguay was just helping the Nazis during this fight, ugh, yikes, that's kind of an insult to an entire nation, which, I don't know, just seems a little rude to me. Also, it just doesn't make thematic sense. This is a card that lets you attack the British. So why is it named after the city? The Gaffspee didn't attack the British from Punta del Este. So why is it named that? This feels so much like a misprint. Really what this card should be named? This card that lets you attack the British? This card that lets the Gaffspee attack? Is Gaffspee Attacks. Or Gaffspee Ambush, or just Ambushed, or something like that. Take a page out of Shores of Tripoli has a card called Tripoli Attacks. It lets Tripoli attack. You draw that card and you're like, I wonder what this card does. It says Tripoli Attacks. I guess this lets me attack. When I draw Punta del Este, man, what do you think I know? You think I speak Spanish? You think I know any other words other than English? Don't you know the old saying, if you speak 3 languages, you're trilingual. If you speak 2 languages, you're bilingual. And if you speak 1 language, you're American? You think I know these words? I don't know any words. The only other language I speak is Texan. But basically, just rename the card. Call it Gaffspy Attacks. Not only have you made a card unthematic, but you've also called an entire nation Nazis, which I think is unjustified and seems kind of rude. Okay, moving on. Military Order 115.39. So, according to this, it's the authorization to disrupt and attack enemy cargo ships with all available means, and to engage enemy naval forces if the main task required it. So, as far as I understand, this is just the order that the Gaffspy received of war's on, go and attack the merchant vessels. That effect happens at, like, the beginning of the game. Like, that's the inciting incident. This isn't a thing that can happen partway through the game. It's not like halfway through the game and it's like, oh, by the way, you were allowed to attack British ships this whole time. Oh, wow, good. I'm glad I guessed right. That's not how it happened at all. Now, what this card does is it places another freighter on the board and lets you, like, resupply better, and it basically just sets up more weaknesses. So you could name this something like stretch supply lines, or something like that to represent more weaknesses. Although, what I think might be better and more specific and more accurate is naming this card Stolen Manifest. As a lot of what was done by the Gaffspy when it took these merchant vessels was steal their shipping manifests, look through the data, figure out the trajectory of different convoys, and then determine where other targets were. Okay, it'd be a little weird that you can use this without having taken a ship, but I mean, the Gaffspy took 9 ships, and you need 5 to win, so the implication is that you've already taken a lot of ships at the start of the game. And so the idea of you having this card representing, oh, look at this intel that we got off of one of the captured ships. It's going to tell us where some of the freighters are. You play this, and hey, there's the freighter over there. That makes a lot of sense. And choosing when to do that, of like you can be keeping track of the freighters and whatnot, and then you choose when to attack, revealing you know their information, and then later they change the route, which is why you can't reuse it. I think that makes sense to me of why it should be named that. Naming it after Hitler saying, oh, you can now attack the British, when that was the inciting incident, I understand that this was a big deal. This was a major historical event, but it's not really a major historical event that takes place within the timeline of the game. Again, you win after you sink 5 ships, so the implication is that you've, like, already sunk 5, and if you sink 5 more, then you did better than happened historically. So, like, this happened months ago. How is it happening again? I guess maybe it's talking about the all available means, and maybe this was a new thing of like, okay, now you can be ruthless or something, and so you're, I don't know, just name it Stolen Manifest. Okay. Hans Longdorff. So, I was okay with Sir Admiral Harwood, Admiral, right? Being a named character because you play as Henry Harwood. You play as sort of a collage of characters. But when you're playing as the Germans, you really are playing as Hans Langsdorff. You don't really have a big fleet of ships that you're commanding. You're commanding the Gaffspy, and you're commanding the Altmark. And the effect of this card is mostly in relation to the Altmark. So shouldn't this card be named after the captain of the Altmark? Whoever that guy was? Look up whoever he is. I mean, that sounds like a character that should be named. You're playing as Hans Langsdorff. And then you have your captain of the ship, and maybe he does a thing where he's able to move more efficiently and silently and resupply you and get your plane fixed with new parts and, you know, move around. So name it after him. Basically everything you do as the German player is Hans Langsdorff doing a thing. So why is there a card that just represents him doing it more, and why does it have to do with a ship that he didn't command? Okay. Pocket battleships. Which, yes, it should be the singular pocket battleship. The Gaffspy was a pocket battleship, and the pocket battleship had specific capabilities that made it uniquely suited for the task that it was doing, making it very hard for the British cruisers and British Navy in general to both catch and properly combat it. Most of the ships that could combat it effectively weren't fast enough to catch it, and most of the ships that were fast enough to catch it weren't powerful enough to combat it, which is why they had to use all these light cruisers to try to fight something that was effectively a battleship. So while it may come off as like, okay, you're just naming it after what it is, everything you do in this game is as a pocket battleship. Why is it different? It's like, well, okay, it has unique capabilities that maybe the British weren't ready for. And so you can surprise the British with just how effective a pocket battleship is and do this hit and run move. You could also name this card Hit and Run Tactics, because that's literally what you do. You move, you hit, you run. That's what the card does. And that would be fine, and I would be okay with calling it Hit and Run Tactics, and maybe would prefer that to calling it Pocket Battleship. But I'm fine with calling it Pocket Battleship. You're being specific and teaching some history, and I like that. Okay. New paintwork for the Gaffspee. So this is a little wordy. And okay, it's translated from Spanish, so they don't know that it's actually called paint job, not paint work. And like, that's such a pedantic thing. It's like someone who doesn't speak English is like, what? That's paint job, but not paint work. Those words are so similar to each other. Why do you say it one way and not the other way? It's just the way the English, it's just the way the language works. And honestly, I would just call this card paint job. Art is great. You say like, oh, paint job. Oh, it fools someone to thinking that we're another ship. Oh. Or if you want to be more specific, you can call it ally paint job. And yeah, it seems like the ability is strong, but again, I'm not speaking about strategy here. But yeah, the idea of you like, oh, hello, fellow allies, I too am an ally. I painted myself like an ally. Totally makes sense. Great design. Good. Just a little wordy on the title. I'd change it to just paint job. The second funnel, same idea. It's different enough from the paint job. It's like, oh, instead of changing how we're painted, we're going to change our silhouette on the horizon. And so it's like a similar kind of effect where we avoid getting found, but it allows us to be a little more mobile because they don't think that we're a military ship at long range, and so we're able to stay at long range. So good. Really well-designed card, and how it's like different from this. And, they could have named all of these paint job, but they didn't. They went the extra mile to give them different names and different arts. And then you have the mysterious Gaffshear, which is the sister ship of the Gaffspee, as far as I understand. Why does this card let the Gaffspee not be found? That makes no sense. Why does painting your ship to look like an ally ship do the same thing as the existence of a friendly ship in the area generally doing what you're doing? How does that make any sense? Especially when you can name this card after a third trick that the Gaffspee did to fool the allies. You name this card and you use this art, false colors. The Gaffspee would raise fake flags. Now, I believe they did it with the French flag. I don't know if they did it with the British flag. To fool people into thinking, oh, we're this country, we're that country. And that way it makes a lot of sense. Oh, you have a card representing, hey, we fool them with a new paint job. We fool them with false flags. We fool them with changing our silhouette on the horizon. You have each of these different specific tricks, and the same trick doesn't work multiple times because like the allies get wise to it. It makes so much sense. You're so close to having really good set of thematic cards that represent this, and then you just like randomly assign the ability of a new paint job and a new funnel being the same as another boat existing, which is why I think the Kriegsmarine card should be named after the Gaffshear. And this should be called False Colors. And then you use the art from the Royal Navy. You have this be False Colors, and then you give this art literally anything else, and you just call it drills. And you're done great. And yeah, and you can give it this art. This looks like people drilling. Yeah, although that they're in German uniforms, so you may have to work on that. But yeah, it just does not work. Okay, Montevideo. This is really good, real close to being good. I would just add it to Retreat to Montevideo. Again, it's sort of implying passively that Montevideo and that Uruguay was just choosing to help the Nazis, which they really weren't. They really didn't like the Nazis. Were kind of using them to be helped, and they didn't really want to get in the middle of things, and they were like, okay, we don't want to be a jerk. We'll let him stay here a little longer than normal, but we're going to make him free their prisoners, and then we're going to make him get out. Again, this is my understanding. If I'm wrong about this, let me know, but don't imply that if you're going to imply that an entire country was supporting the Nazis openly, you better be really sure about that. So I would just call it Retreat to Montevideo, or Retreat. Retreat to Montevideo is fine, but the effect works good, and yeah. Okay, talked about the second funnel, and then let's talk about Marconi's transmitter. We'll end on a good note. Well-designed card. Good design card. There's the transmitter, guy working on it. It's representing the idea of radio warfare, of giving out false messages and hiding your own messages and tricking the enemy with radio, which is very much a thing during this era. And I guess it's representing that the Germans had really good radio equipment. I don't know if that's true. But yeah, the idea of you using a radio to fool the British into moving 3 spaces into a space where they don't want to be, or confusing a freight ship, you know, being like, ooh, I'm in this area, you better go back to port where it's safe, and, you know, and then you force them back to where they were. And all of those kinds of things seem like things that you would do on a radio. Really well-designed card. Good art. It matches. It's very good. So, I hope that you're able to take some of these ideas and fix some of these cards, because, oh man, this game looks really, really good. And it's so important for a card to have good theme and to be very specific and for me to know what the card is doing when I play it. And you have all the pieces here. For the most part, you just have to sort of shuffle things around and take this art and apply it to there and take this name and maybe swap it here and just add a word here and add a word there. Hopefully you can watch this when you do it. And if you do not add every single one of these ideas, then I'm never speaking to you again. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Godspeed.